Hey, what's up, everybody? If you're curious about how to apply epoxy to a piece of wood that you might have for a tabletop or some other home project, hopefully this video can help you out. This is something that we recently did. You can see the finished product here. So what you're going to need to get started is some propane burners. I've found that the typical camping propane ones are able to work really well because you can still hold ignition when it's tilted upside down. Next thing you're going to want to do is level out your piece of wood, right? Notice there's already been a coating applied to this particular project, but the process is indeed the same. So notice the flat piece of cardboard with some plastic covering, and I'm essentially taking some shims and we're going to just kind of work them underneath there and make sure everything is nice and level. This project will get incredibly messy, so prepare yourself for that. Notice the tape here. I have taped about halfway up the project. This basically helps when things dribble off the edge, it's not going to stick to the underside, but more about that later. So the first thing you're going to want to do obviously is take your resin and your hardener. They obviously come, if you've researched this at all, they come separately, two separate products, and when they're mixed, they essentially harden. Notice the pre-filled line that I have. You'll have to read the instruction manual in your particular epoxy setup. I'll put a couple of links below for some recommended epoxy in case you're interested. But notice I pre-measured and put a little red line there, and I'm going to fill it exactly to the line. Notice how thick this resin is. So one little tip here, if you put it, or the hardener or the resin, before you pour into warm water and let it soak, or you can sit it in front of a heater like this and just let it kind of warm up to 75 degrees. That's the optimal temperature for this particular resin and hardener, but again, you'll have to read the instructions as to the optimal temperature. You're just going to let that sit and warm up, and it's going to kind of work all those bubbles out to the surface, and then the liquid will become incredibly clear and by far less viscous. In other words, it will pour a lot easier. So we've got the resin to the left and the hardener to the right, and again, very precise measurements there. Now it's time to combine the two together, so we'll go ahead and do that now. And you're going to want to use a round-ended scraping tool to get all that stuff out of there. Again, you want the measurement to be precise. So you don't want anything stuck left on the bottom of the cup. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the heater here and continue to stir. You want it to be at that proper temperature. So this is a little strategy in case your ambient temperature of your room cannot meet the minimum temperature requirements. And notice how cloudy it is as it's being stirred here. And this is what you want. You want to keep stirring it until it becomes essentially crystal clear. Okay. All right, so we're going to go back to our surface here. And again, whether it's your first or your second pour, this is essentially how it works, okay? Just to give you an idea of the process. So we're going to apply it, just kind of pour it out. Now again, more is better in this particular case. You don't want to have to go back and mix more, so make sure you have the adequate amount first off. So we'll have a little bit left over and we'll end up pitching that when we're done. But we just wanted to make a little bit more to make sure that indeed this will apply the entire surface without running out. All right, so we just kind of applied it, as you can see here, and we'll take this handy little scraper tool. I would definitely recommend this. Let's zoom in and you can kind of see how this works. You basically just kind of comb that epoxy so it's super workable, and those little grooves in this little plastic piece allows everything to kind of pass through. It doesn't scrape it all off the edge, right? And you're just going to want to work it back and forth like you see here. Make sure all the cracks are, of course, coated. Make sure it's coated evenly as best as you can. This stuff is self-leveling, so you're not going to have to actually level the liquid itself, but you can see how important it is with those shims there to the left to make sure your piece of wood or whatever you're coating is really level, right? Because if it's not, you're going to get a pretty big mess. Things are going to run off and whatnot. And you can let me fast forward it just a little bit here, but you can see runoff starting to happen. There's a pool there to the left. You might catch a glimpse of that. Here's another angle for you as we are applying it with this comb or this application tool. I don't know the name of this little comb thing, but there's some spillage there happening. Again, make sure you have plastic down. It gets pretty nasty. And we're just going to kind of push it over the edges there as much as we can. And obviously if you're applying to a coat like that, or to the side, if you're applying a coat to the side, you can, of course, just kind of brush it on there with a brush or something. All right, so next we're going to light up the propane torch here. And I will put a link for this particular tank and torch down below in the description if you want to check that out. Some of these propane torches, don't see them, I'm turning it upside down. Some of them will go out, but these little camping ones are ideal because they stay lit upside down, okay? Obviously use extreme caution when you're dealing with propane. Notice the distance between the surface and the flame. And you're essentially, as per the instructions, you'll need to check your instructions for exactly how this works, but you'll essentially move this back and forth approximately 8 to 12 inches away from the surface, and you're going to be heating that up to kind of work out all of those bubbles that are still in there. In a minute, I'll show you another angle of what those bubbles look like. You get a real appreciation for what we're doing here. Okay, so we're going to uniformly heat that as shown. Make sure you get as much of it as you can, and we're doing this for several minutes. Again, this video is just to show you and to inform you kind of the general process of how this works. We've already coated the sidings of this particular piece of wood with a brush, so we're not really interested in applying that right now. We're not worrying about having a fresh coat of epoxy on the sides of this surface at this point. All right, you can see it starting to continuing to spill over a little bit, and that tape is essentially going to protect the bottoms and the edges from this stuff hardening on. We're going to peel that tape off a little later. In fact, within about 8 hours is kind of the recommendation. If you wait too long to take off the tape, it's a hot, nasty mess. All right, so next, notice this little tool. It's a very sharp end, and we're picking off hairs because no matter what, any movement in the air, even if you do your best to close windows and doors and not move much, you're going to get some little almost microscopic, but you can see them under the right light. These little fuzzes or these little hairs floating around. So we're picking those out. Here's a better view of the bubbles coming to the surface. You can see them kind of popping. The ones that don't pop are likely hairs, and so we just kind of pop our little tool in there and grab that hair. It sticks to the tool and is able to be extracted pretty easily. Now again, do this while it's wet. This stuff is self-leveling, so even if you touch it at this point, it will go back to its leveled state. And notice the heat here. You'll obviously want to take precautions. Make sure you wear, for example, a mask and gloves. This stuff is probably not the most nature friendly or friendly to the lungs and the skin, right? So please use proper precautions. Make sure you read your instructions really well before starting a project like this. And if you have flammable liquids and you dump this resin, this hot resin, into a garbage can, for example, that has like oily rags, you can risk ignition. This could actually light on fire. So that is a potential risk there for you. So be really careful with this stuff. All right, so you can see this stuff hardens pretty quickly. This is within about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes after we have dried it or done our first propane torch application. And here's another view of the side and the spillage. We're not really worried about that right now. Again, we're going to take all that off once everything's good and dry. In fact, we'll be sanding the sides a little bit. So we're going to do another layer of, or another propane brush to heat things up, get more of those bubbles out, and then take our tape off. You did not see the tape removal part, but again, that tape is removed about 8 hours after. Okay, you don't want it to get super hard, but you want to take it off when it's a little soft. There you go. You can see the sides there with the tape removed. Okay. Now you might think, oh, this is pretty unsightly, right? Well, of course, we're going to sand those sides down. And it doesn't have to be perfect because the sides, of course, are a rough surface. But we are going to sand that down at this point. In fact, we're going to sand the entire surface down after a good 72 hours at least of hardening. Before you sand, you want everything to be really, really strong. Read those instructions to see how long you have to wait. And of course, we have a little mouse sander. Highly recommended. You can get into these little grooves and crevices, and we're going to be sanding down that. Now you might say, oh, look how roughed up that surface is. No worries at all. After you sand it, you can vacuum up the sediment, and then you're going to do another pour on top of that like that. And that fuzzy sediment will just disappear before your eyes. A fresh layer of epoxy will cure all of that, and it'll look shiny, glassy again. And that's it. You will repeat this process until the adequate number of coats have been applied to your wood. And that's pretty much the project. So hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you very much. If you have liked this video, please do me a favor and click the subscribe button. And good luck with your project.